Hi. Good to see you. The nurse decided to take care of a sick beggar. Everyone made fun of him in the hospital days later. The nurse was paralyzed when he saw a millionaire at his door. Who is going to take care of that one? One of the nurses asked with disdain. I don't know. I don't want to get involved. Should you? Be full of illness, answered another, turning his face. Rafael watched the scene with a knot in his chest. He couldn't believe his colleague's lack of compassion for him. Eduardo was a human being who needed help like any other patient with a sigh. Determined, he approached the stretcher and began to examine Eduardo, ignoring the disapproving looks around him. Come on, friend. Are you sure? Rafael said peacefully while adjusting the serum and beginning to clean Eduardo's wounds. The murmurs of discontent among the other patients and hospital employees rang around, some casting disdainful glances at Eduardo, while others whispered among themselves questioning why Rafael was wasting his time with a dirty, smelly beggar. But Rafael, he didn't let himself be affected. He was determined to provide Eduardo with the care and respect he deserved regardless of his situation. Why are we wasting resources on him? He doesn't even seem to care about getting better, commented a nurse, casting a disapproving look at Rafael. I don't understand why the nurse, Rafael. You're wasting time with these types of people. They'll only be a problem again when they get out of here, said one patient to another in a low voice, but loud enough for Rafael to hear despite the words. Cruel things that resonated around him. Rafael continued his work, focused on taking care of Eduardo in the best way possible. He knew that he could not change everyone's mentality, but at least he could make a difference in the life of that man who had been so unfairly treated. Rafael was known for his dedication and empathy. In the hospital where he worked, he always did his best to care for each patient with dignity, regardless of their origin. That day the hospital was, especially the emergency room, was full with patients and family members in a hurry, doctors and nurses running from one place to another. Rafael remained calm, dealing with each case with his usual patience and professionalism. He knew that in the midst of chaos, his tranquility was essential to provide the best possible care. But Rafael did not imagine that this beggar, the one he helped, would mark his life forever. Eduardo, a beggar, had been run over when the paramedics brought him inside. The strong smell and his appearance caught everyone's attention. Eduardo was very dirty. His clothes were dirty, torn, and his body was thin, practically skin and bones. The other employees and patients looked at him with disgust and contempt, and some even turned away, covering their nose and muttering unpleasant comments with every movement. Rafael was careful and meticulous. He knew that Eduardo was in a delicate condition, and he needed urgent treatment. Eduardo seemed unconscious, but Rafael spoke to him anyway, believing that somehow a friendly word could reach his lifelong sleepy mind. It matters. I can't leave anyone behind, Rafael thought, reaffirming to himself the reason why he had chosen nursing as a profession while working. Rafael began to wonder about Eduardo's story, how he had ended up on the street, what had led him to that desperate situation. He knew that each person had a story often marked by tragedies and misfortunes. Rafael wanted to know Eduardo's story to help him recover, and if it were possible to help him find a path to a better life. Rafael continued to care for him. Eduardo throughout the day, checking his vital signs, changing bandages, and making sure he received the necessary medications. Little by little, Eduardo began to show signs of improvement. His eyes, they opened briefly, and he murmured something inaudible. Rafael was at his side, holding his hand and offering words of encouragement. You're doing well, Eduardo. Let's get you out of this, I promise, Rafael said with an encouraging smile at the end of the shift. Rafael was exhausted but felt deep satisfaction. He knew he had done a good job. Difference in someone's life that day. As he left the hospital, he thought about what else he could do to help Eduardo. He was determined to not only treat his physical wounds, but also to understand and alleviate the emotional suffering that Eduardo was clearly carrying. The following days brought additional challenges. Eduardo remained in the hospital, and the attitude of the other employees had not changed. Some suggested that he be transferred to a shelter, but Rafael insisted that he stay until he was completely recovered. He is not ready to leave. Here he needs more care, Rafael argued with his supervisor. Rafael, we have limited resources. We need the beds for other patients, the supervisor responded. But Rafael did not give up and insisted. And what will happen to him if we send him out now, the supervisor? He hesitated but agreed to let Eduardo stay a few more days. Rafael took advantage of that time to do everything he could for Eduardo. He talked to him. He encouraged him to talk about his past and offered him the support that Eduardo had never received. Before, little by little, Eduardo began to open up, revealing parts of his life that explained how he had ended up on the street. I have had a good life. You know, family, friends, everything. But everything fell apart, Eduardo said one day with a low and trembling voice. What happened? Rafael asked carefully. Without wanting to put too much pressure on him, mental problems, alcoholism, I lost everything I left because I didn't want to be a burden on my family, Eduardo continued with tears rolling down his dirty face. Rafael felt a lump in his throat hearing that he knew that many people in Eduardo's situation, they faced enormous challenges, often without the necessary support to overcome them. More than ever, he was determined to help Eduardo find a way back to a dignified life in the hospital. Eduardo's presence went unnoticed. His unkempt appearance made many patients and employees twisted their noses. Contempt was evident in the looks and murmurs in the hallways. Eduardo, still weak and vulnerable, felt the weight of those looks, which made his recovery even more difficult. Rafael, however, remained firm in his decision to care for Eduardo. He did not allow himself to be affected by the comments and maintained his commitment to dignity and respect. Why do you care so much about him? Asked a curious patient who was observing Rafael devoting so much time to Eduardo. Because he deserves a second chance like all of us, Rafael responded with conviction. Rafael's response did not convince everyone. Many continued to judge Eduardo by what they saw on the surface without taking the trouble to understand his story. Of the nurses who had expressed since the day of Eduardo's arrival commented loud enough for Rafael to hear, we have many patients who really need help. I don't understand why waste time on a hopeless case like him. Rafael felt the rage boiling inside him, but he took a deep breath. He knew that yelling or arguing wouldn't change her mind. Instead, he focused on taking care of Eduardo, cleaning his wounds with the same attention and care that he devoted to any other patient. Actions spoke louder than words. Eduardo noticed everything. He perceived Rafael's effort and the indifference of others. In a rare moment of conversation, expressed his gratitude and his sadness. I don't deserve this, Rafael. Why are you doing all this for me? Eduardo asked with his voice weak and full of doubt. We all deserve to be treated with dignity, Eduardo. It doesn't matter what happened in the past. What matters is what we do now, Rafael responded while adjusting Eduardo's pillow. The days dragged by. Although the attitude of the staff did not change, Eduardo began to improve. The wounds healed slowly and gained strength. Rafael continued by his side, encouraging him and keeping hope alive. Other patients who had initially shown contempt began to notice the change in Eduardo and to respect Rafael's dedication. Perhaps you are right, Rafael. Perhaps we all deserve a second chance, said one of the patients who had previously questioned Rafael's dedication. It's not easy, but it's worth it, Rafael responded, smiling. Eduardo was slightly starting to show signs of improvement, but he was still far from being fully recovered. Rafael was doing his best to take care of him by making sure his wounds were clean and that he was taking his medications correctly. However, one day Rafael was called to the head of nursing. Marta knew that it would not be good news. Rafael, we need to free Eduardo's bed. They will discharge him, the head of nursing said bluntly. Rafael was shocked. He knew that Eduardo was not ready to leave the hospital, but he still needs care. Eduardo is not ready to go out, Rafael replied, trying to stay calm. The head nurse sighed, seeming understanding but firm. I understand, Rafael, but we don't have the resources to support him. There are many other patients here who need attention, she explained. Rafael felt a knot in his stomach. He knew that Eduardo had nowhere to go and that he was still too weak to take care of himself. He tried to argue once more. Rafael said, worried, if we expel him now, he might not survive yet. He is very weak. The head nurse shook her head, showing that she understood the seriousness of the situation, but her hands were tied. The decision has been made. Rafael, do what you can to help him. But he has to leave tomorrow, he said, ending the conversation. Rafael left the office feeling helpless and frustrated. He returned to Eduardo's room trying to think of a solution. Eduardo was sitting on the bed looking out the window with a lost look. Rafael sat next to him and took a deep breath. Eduardo, I need to tell you something. They're going to discharge you tomorrow, Rafael said carefully. Eduardo turned his head slowly, his eyes showing a mixture of surprise and fear. But I'm not ready yet. Where I'm going to go? Eduardo asked with a trembling voice. Rafael took Eduardo's hand, trying to give him some peace of mind. I know, Eduardo, and I will do whatever is necessary to help you with me in my apartment, Rafael said with determination. Eduardo seemed relieved but still worried. He knew that the situation was not ideal, but he trusted in Rafael. Thank you, Rafael. I don't know what I would do without you, said Eduardo, sincerely grateful. The next day, with the help of some colleagues, Rafael organized Eduardo's things and prepared him for discharge. Eduardo was still weak and had assistance walking. Rafael took Eduardo to his car. Under the curious, and in some cases, contemptuous glances of other employees and patients when they arrived at Rafael's apartment, Eduardo looked around feeling a little uncomfortable. He was not used to depending so much on someone, but he knew. I didn't have a choice. This is where you're going to stay. We're going to fix everything, Rafael said as he helped Eduardo get settled on the couch. The first few days were challenging. Eduardo still needed constant care, and Rafael did his best to balance that with his work at the hospital. He got up early to take care of Eduardo. He prepared nutritious meals and helped with basic tasks at night. After work, he continued to take care of his friend, changing bandages and making sure he took his meals. Medications. Despite the difficulties, Eduardo began to show signs of recovery. He was still weak, but he was beginning to gain weight and look healthier. Rafael noticed small improvements every day, and that motivated him to continue. He knew that they were on the right path, even if it was a long day for sure. Night, while they were sitting in the small living room of the apartment, Eduardo looked at Rafael with an expression of gratitude. I don't know how to thank you for all this, Rafael. You have changed my life, Eduardo said. Excited, Rafael smiled, feeling deep satisfaction. You deserve this opportunity, Eduardo. Everyone deserves a second chance, and I will be here to help you if necessary, Rafael responded with conviction. Eduardo nodded, feeling a little more hopeful about the future. However, some challenges began to arise. Eduardo's presence began to attract the attention of the neighbors. Many looked with distrust and made malicious comments every time they passed by the hallway. One morning, while Eduardo to take a short walk around the building to strengthen his legs, one of the neighbors, Mr. Gutierrez, found them in the elevator. He looked at Eduardo with contempt and without any concern about being heard said, "This is no place for a beggar. People like him should be in a shelter, not here." Rafael felt the anger rise, but he took a deep breath before responding. Eduardo is my friend, and he will stay with me as long as I need him. He deserves to be treated with dignity like any person, Rafael responded, trying to stay calm. The man, Gutierrez, snorted and left the elevator, shaking his head in disapproval. Eduardo, who had heard everything, lowered his head, feeling embarrassed. Rafael squeezed his shoulder, trying to convey confidence. Don't pay attention to him, Eduardo. Some people, they just don't understand, Rafael said, trying to cheer up his friend. In the days afterwards, the negative comments from the neighbors continued. Some people murmured things as they passed by Eduardo, and even some children, influenced by their parents, pointed and laughed at the situation began to weigh on Eduardo, who was already struggling to regain his self-esteem and dignity. One afternoon, while Rafael was preparing dinner, Eduardo, he let out some steam. Maybe it's better that I leave, Rafael. I don't want to cause you problems. People here hate me, Eduardo said with a voice full of sadness. Rafael stopped what he was doing and sat next to Eduardo, looking into his eyes. Eduardo, you are not going anywhere. I brought you here because I believe in you. I am not going to let people's ignorance affect you. We are going to get through this together, Rafael said. Eduardo firmly nodded, but Rafael could see that the situation was weighing heavily on him. Determined to change this, Rafael began to talk to some neighbors, trying to change their perception of Eduardo. He explained Eduardo's situation and that he was trying hard to recover. I know it can be difficult to understand, but Eduardo is a person like any other. He is fighting to recover and deserves a chance, said Rafael. With sincerity in conversations in the hallways, some neighbors began to change their attitude. Seeing Rafael's effort and Eduardo's humanity, however, others continued to maintain their prejudices, making their displeasure clear. One night when Rafael was arriving home, he found Mrs. Martinez, a neighbor known for being quite talkative. She approached him with a serious expression. Rafael knows you're trying to help, but some people here don't feel safe with him around. Maybe you should reconsider, she said with a worried tone disguised as Rafael knew he needed to keep his cool. Calm so as not to worsen the situation, Mrs. Martinez. I understand your concerns, but Eduardo is not a danger to anyone. He is recovering and I am taking care of him. I only ask that you try to understand, and if possible support. Rafael responded firmly, but without hostility. The conversation did not seem to have he convinced the lady, but Rafael was not willing to give up. He knew that the change of attitude would take time, and that he would need patience and persistence. Rafael decided that regardless of the opinions of the others would continue to support Eduardo. He believed that over time people would see the truth and put aside their prejudices. Over the following weeks, Rafael continued to work hard both in the hospital and at home. He noticed small improvements in Eduardo every day, and that was what he believed. Motivated to continue, the days became increasingly tense for Rafael and Eduardo. Despite the improvements in Eduardo's health, the negative comments from the neighbors continued to echo in the hallways of the building. Rafael was always firm in his decision to take care of Eduardo. Began to realize that the situation was escalating. The owner of the apartment, Mr. Salazar, a severe and unsympathetic man, finally decided to take action. One afternoon, while Rafael was in the hospital, Eduardo heard a loud knock on the door. He got up with difficulty and went to open it, meeting Mr. Salazar with an expression of displeasure. Eduardo felt a cold on his back, but tried to remain calm. "Where is Rafael?" Mr. Salazar asked without saying hello. "He's at work. Can I help with something?" Eduardo responded, trying to be polite. Mr. Salazar ignored him and entered the apartment. Looking around with disdain, he turned to Eduardo, his eyes full of impatience. "Listen, you can't stay here. This building is no place for beggars. I've already received many complaints from the neighbors. Oh, you leave or Rafael will be evicted," said Mr. Salazar without room for negotiation. Eduardo felt a squeeze in his chest. He knew he was causing problems for Rafael, but he had nowhere to go before he could answer the question. The door opened and Rafael entered carrying a bag of groceries. He stopped when he saw Mr. Salazar and Eduardo's worried face. "What is happening here?" Rafael asked, leaving the bag on the table. Mr. Salazar turned to Rafael without hiding his irritation. "I already have made it very clear, either he leaves or you leave. I cannot allow a beggar to stay here disturbing the other residents," said Mr. Salazar, crossing his arms. Rafael felt the anger rising, but he knew he needed to stay calm to resolve the situation. "Eduardo did not will go nowhere. He is under my care, and he has every right to be here. If it means that we both have to leave, then we will both go," Rafael responded decidedly. Mr. Salazar was surprised by Rafael's response. He clearly expected Rafael to give in to the pressure. But Rafael was determined to protect Eduardo. "Are you serious? Are you willing to lose your apartment for him?" Mr. Salazar asked in disbelief. "Yes, I am. Eduardo is my friend, and I am not going to abandon him. If necessary, we will look for another place to stay." "Let's stay," said Rafael, looking directly into Mr. Salazar's eyes. Mr. Salazar was silent for a moment, measuring Rafael's words. Finally, he shrugged his shoulders, showing disinterest. "Very well, that's your decision. You have until the end of the month to vacate the apartment," he said. Before leaving and slamming the door, Eduardo sat on the couch with his head down. He felt guilty for causing Rafael so much trouble. "I'm sorry, Rafael. Didn't want to cause this. Maybe it's better that I go," he said. Eduardo, with a voice full of sadness, Rafael sat next to him and put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Eduardo, we are going to find a solution together. I am not going to abandon you. We will find a place where we can be at peace without these prejudices," Rafael said with a consoling tone. The next few days were dedicated to searching for a new place to live. Between his shifts at the hospital and caring for Eduardo, Rafael spent hours looking for accessible apartments. The task was not easy, but he was determined not to give up during that period. Eduardo strove to help as much as he could despite still being recovering. They formed a united team, facing the challenges together. One afternoon, while Rafael was in the hospital, Eduardo received a call from a real estate agent that Rafael had contacted. Wrote down all the information, and when Rafael got home, "I couldn't wait to tell him the news." "Rafael, I think I found a place," the agent said. "We can visit it tomorrow. It's a little out of the center, but it looks good," Eduardo said with a smile. Hopeful Rafael returned the smile, feeling a wave of relief. "That's great, Eduardo. We're going to take a look tomorrow." And if it's good, we'll move as soon as possible, Rafael responded, full of optimism. The next day, they went to visit the apartment. The place was modest but cozy and quiet, away from the prejudiced eyes of the former neighbors. Rafael spoke with the owner, explaining Eduardo's situation honestly. To his surprise, the owner was understanding and welcoming. Everyone deserves a chance to start over. If you need anything, I'm here, said the owner, shaking Rafael's hand with El Nuevo Hogar secured. Rafael and Eduardo began to plan the move. The relief was palpable, and they both felt that they were finally finding a little peace. As he packed, he looked at Eduardo with a smile. We are almost there, Eduardo. A new beginning for both of us, said Rafael, feeling optimistic about the future. Eduardo nodded, feeling more hopeful than ever. The morning after the move, Rafael was organizing the last boxes in the new apartment. Eduardo, still weak, rested on the sofa, but the expression on his face was calmer than Rafael had ever seen. The peace of the new home seemed to be beginning to take effect. However, the calm was interrupted by a firm knock on the door. Rafael frowned in confusion. He didn't expect. Rafael opened the door and found an elegant man dressed in an impeccable suit standing there. The man exudes an aura of authority and wealth, something that contrasted sharply with the humble environment they were in. Where is my son? The man asked with an urgency in his voice that did not match his controlled appearance. Rafael was surprised by the question. He looked at the man, confused. Son, what are you talking about? Rafael responded, trying to process what was happening. The man entered uninvited, his eyes scanning the small apartment until they landed on Eduardo, who was now sitting looking with a mixture of surprise and fear. Eduardo, the man's voice trembled slightly. Eduardo looked at him. His eyes widened. They grew larger as they recognized the figure in front of him. Dad, Eduardo murmured, the word coming out almost like a whisper. Rafael stood there in disbelief. He had no idea what was happening, but clearly the situation was more complex than he could have ever imagined. The silence in the room apartment was palpable while Armando, the millionaire, tried to control his emotions. Rafael closed the door slowly, still trying to understand what was unfolding in front of him. Eduardo is my son. He disappeared years ago, said Armando, turning to Rafael with an expression of pain mixed with hope. Rafael felt a knot in his chest. He could never have imagined that the man he had taken in was the son of a millionaire. I didn't know Eduardo never mentioned. Rafael began. Still dazed, Armando took a deep breath, sitting down on a chair in front of the two of them. He knew that he needed to tell the whole story so that Eduardo and Rafael would understand everything. Eduardo always had everything that money could buy. He studied in the best schools. He had all the opportunities. But one day, he began to change. He became more secluded, more distant. I thought it was just a phase, Armando began, his voice low but clear. Eduardo looked at the ground, his fists clenched. Rafael watched the scene, perceiving the weight of Armando's words. He had a mental breakdown at that moment. I was so focused on work and companies that I did not see what was happening under my own roof. Eduardo disappeared one night, and alone then I realized how serious the situation was. He left without a trace, and since then I lived with the guilt of not having been a present father when he needed me most, continued Armando. Eduardo finally raised his head, his eyes full of pain and anger. Why now, Dad? Where were you when I needed you most? I was in the streets alone, fighting to survive, said Eduardo, his voice full of bitterness. Armando closed eyes for a moment, feeling each word like a blow. I made mistakes, son, huge mistakes. I tried to find you, but it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. I hired detectives, I informed the police, but you seem to have disappeared completely. I didn't give up, Eduardo. I never gave up on finding you, Armando said with emotion. Eduardo shook his head, struggling to control his emotions. I had to deal with the pain alone. I didn't know how to deal with my own mind, and I ended up in the streets without anyone. I lost my mind. I was confused. I didn't know how to get back home, and after I got better, I didn't want to go back. You always ignored me. You always put work first. You only thought about making money. I remember the times I called you to talk, to tell you how my day was, and you said that you were busy because you had a business meeting or that you were going on a trip, Eduardo said, tears now running down his face. Armando stood up and took a few steps towards Eduardo, stopping before kneeling in front of him. Eduardo, I know that nothing he says it can erase the years of suffering, but I am here now. I want to correct my mistakes. If you allow me, I want to be the father that you always deserved, the one that I failed to be, said Armando with his words full of supplication. The tension in the apartment was palpable as Eduardo and Armando looked at each other's emotions. Rafael watched the scene with apprehension, knowing that this conversation could determine the direction of their lives from now on. You never understood me, Eduardo said. His words seemed driven by years of accumulated resentment. Armando sighed. Feeling the weight of his son's accusations, he knew that he had failed Eduardo in many ways, but he also carried the weight of his own struggles and regrets. He was trying to do what's best for you, Armando responded, his voice softer now, but still full of defense. Eduardo shook his head, his eyes burning with the intensity of his emotions. The best thing for me was that you only cared about your empire, your reputation. I was just an insignificant detail to you, he replied hotly, the words coming out harsher than he intended. Armando looked down for a moment, feeling the truth of his son's words cut deep. He knew that he had been negligent, that he had put his ambitions above his needs. About your family, I know I failed with you, Eduardo. I know I didn't. I was there when you needed me most, but I want to change that. I want to do things right now, Armando said, his voice full of sincere regret. Eduardo looked at his father, seeing the pain and vulnerability in his eyes. He knew that he couldn't simply ignore the past, but he also knew that perhaps there was room for forgiveness and reconciliation. Rafael, watching everything, felt a wave of empathy for both of them. He knew how much Eduardo had suffered, but he also saw the genuine pain and regret in Armando's eyes. It was a complicated situation full of unresolved emotions and deep scars. Eduardo took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked at Rafael, looking for silent support. Rafael only nodded slightly, encouraging him to listen to his father. I don't know, Dad. I need time to process all of this to trust you again. But maybe, just maybe, he's willing to try. Armando smiled sadly, accepting his son's words as a small beginning. Thank you, Eduardo, that's all. I ask for an opportunity to show you that I can be different, that I can be present, Armando responded, taking his son's hand. Rafael felt a weight leave his shoulders. He knew that this was only the first of many difficult conversations that Eduardo and Armando would have, but it was a beginning that could lead to healing and rebuilding a relationship that had been broken so long ago. The three remained silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Eduardo, I never stopped looking for you, Armando said with his broken voice. Rafael, feeling that this was a moment of reconciliation that needed to happen without his intervention, took a step back. Maybe I should give them a moment, Rafael suggested, beginning to move toward the door.
No, Rafael.
Stay, you did it. Eduardo, what I couldn't do, you took care of, said Armando, turning to Rafael with gratitude in his eyes. Rafael stopped, feeling a mix of emotions. He had simply done what he believed was right, but now he saw that his actions had had a much greater impact than he could have anticipated. Eduardo looked at Rafael with eyes full of gratitude. Rafael, you are my family. I don't know what I would have done without you. Rafael felt his eyes fill with tears. Never I had expected gratitude. I just wanted to help someone in need. Eduardo, I just did what anyone should do. I'm happy you found your father, Rafael said, his voice soft and full of emotion. Armando took another step towards Eduardo, finally closing the distance between them. He reached out his hand hesitantly before hugging Eduardo tightly. I will never let you go again, son. We will go through this together as a family, said Armando, his voice muffled by Eduardo's shoulder. Eduardo reciprocated the hug, tears running down his river, feeling a mix of relief and happiness. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but with his family reunited, there was hope. The intense conversation with his father, Eduardo, felt a whirlwind of emotions from Rael, who was silently at his side. And then Rafael made a decision. I would like to continue living with you, at least for now. When I'm better, then I will decide what I will do with my life, Eduardo said with determination and gratitude. Rafael smiled, feeling immense relief at Eduardo's decision. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to do it. Do whatever it takes to help Eduardo recover completely, both physically and emotionally. For me, it's okay, Eduardo. Let's take care of each other as friends, as a family, Rafael responded, his words overflowing with warmth and compassion. Armando watched the scene in silence, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew that there was a lot of work to do to rebuild his relationship with Eduardo, but he also knew that the first step had been taken in the right direction. If that is what you want, Eduardo, then I support your decision. I will be here for you no matter what happens, Armando said, his voice soft and full of promises of redemption. Eduardo nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew that there were still many unresolved issues between him and his Father, but I also knew that there was hope for the future. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate your support. And Rafael, thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened to me without you, said Eduardo, his eyes shining with sincere attitude. Rafael's apartment was immersed in an atmosphere of tension and hope. Eduardo, Rafael, and Armando were in the middle of a serious conversation when a firm knock on the door interrupted the moment. Rafael frowned in confusion. Armando exchanged a curious look with Eduardo, who only shrugged shoulders. Who is it? Rafael muttered as he headed towards the door. When he opened it, Mr. Salazar was there. The owner of the apartment seemed uncomfortable but determined. Rafael did not expect to see him there, especially after the recent pressure for Eduardo to leave. Mr. Salazar? Rafael asked, surprised. Mr. Salazar took a step forward, his gaze quickly falling on Armando before focusing on Rafael. I was passing by and I heard some things. I think we need to talk, Mr. Salazar said. Rafael opened the door for us. When Mr. Salazar entered, he took a step inside, casting nervous glances around the apartment before finally speaking. Eduardo, Rafael was wrong. He began taking a deep breath. I misunderstood the situation. Eduardo's health is important, and he must remain here as long as he needs to recover. Eduardo, who was sitting in the sofa, rose with difficulty but with determination. His eyes shone with indignation. So now that you see a millionaire here, do you change your mind? Eduardo asked with a firm voice. Did you throw us out? Because I was a beggar. You are prejudiced, Mr. Salazar, and now you want to come here pretending that you care about him. Mr. Salazar was visibly uncomfortable with the accusation, his hands trembling slightly. Eduardo, I made a mistake. Mr. Salazar tried to explain himself, his voice wavering. It was not correct. From me, but I'm here to correct it. You deserve a chance to recover. Eduardo narrowed his eyes without being convinced by Mr. Salazar's words. You only say that because you saw my father here. Truth, Eduardo continued without giving him a chance to respond. If he wasn't still there, you would have expelled us without thinking twice. The silence that followed was heavy, each word of Eduardo echoing in the small room. Rafael put his hand on Eduardo's shoulder, trying to calm him down. Eduardo, let's listen to what he has to say, Rafael said softly. Mr. Salazar suddenly looked older and tired. I know my actions were motivated by prejudices and unfair assumptions, but I really want to do the right thing now. You can stay here and I will make sure that no one else bothers you, stated Mr. Salazar. Armando, who was watching in silence, took a step forward with furious eyes fixed on Mr. Salazar. How dare you treat my son that way, said Armando with the voice full of indignation. You judged him by his appearance, by his condition. That is unacceptable. Mr. Salazar was visibly uncomfortable with the accusation, his hands trembling slightly. I made a mistake. It was not correct of me, but I am here to correct it. You deserve a chance to recover. Eduardo tried to explain Mr. Salazar with his voice wavering. Mr. Salazar sighed. Suddenly, he looked older and tired. I know that my actions were motivated by prejudices and unfair assumptions, but I really want to do the right thing now. You can stay here and I will make sure that no one else bothers you, said Mr. Salazar, his voice gaining firmness. Armando took a step forward, still furious but willing to listen. You need to understand that what you did it was not just a mistake, it was cruel. My son has already suffered too much in the streets and being treated like this is unacceptable, said Armando, his voice charged with emotion. Armando was furious. The conversation with Mr. Salazar had only intensified his anger, and he could not accept that Eduardo will continue living in that environment. He looked at his son and then at Rafael with a firm and determined expression. Eduardo, you are not going to spend another minute in this house, declared Armando with a sharp voice full of authority. Eduardo looked at his father, surprised by the intensity of his words. I will call a moving company. They will be here in an hour, Armando announced, putting his cell phone in his pocket. Mr. Salazar nodded his head in resignation. I understand, Mr. Armando. I will do whatever is necessary to help with the move, he responded, trying to seem solicitous. Eduardo sighed, feeling exhausted both physically and emotionally. The argument was draining his strength, but he knew he couldn't refuse his father's help at that moment. Time passed quickly and soon the moving company arrived. The workers began to load the boxes and furniture into the truck under the attentive supervision of Armando. Rafael, you have done a great job taking care of my son. I thank you for everything, Armando said with a tone of gratitude. And Lavos, I did what anyone should do. Armando Eduardo is a good person and deserves a chance to recover. Rafael responded with sincerity. With everything ready, Eduardo got up from the couch, walking slowly towards the door. He took one last look at the room. Apartment, feeling strange to leave a place that despite everything had given him a little peace. Come on, son, the new apartment that Eduardo chose will be better for you, said Armando, placing his hand on Eduardo's shoulder. Eduardo nodded, feeling for his father and for Rafael. Together they left the apartment, ready to start over in a new place. Mr. Salazar watched in silence, knowing that his attitude had caused this change, but also realizing that it was the right thing to do. As they got into the car, Eduardo felt a wave of hope. He knew that with the support of Rafael and Armando, he could face anything that came his way, and finally he felt a little stronger and determined to rebuild his life. Eduardo was beginning to adapt to his new life in the new apartment. The place, it was modest, but much more comfortable, and surely the street or the old apartment. Rafael and Armando continued to offer all the support that Eduardo needed, from medical care to emotional support. Rafael helped Ardo with the exercises, physiotherapy. Daily recovery was slow and required patience, but Eduardo was determined to improve. In one of the exercise moments, Rafael encouraged Eduardo, "Let's go, Eduardo, one more time. I know it's difficult, but you're making progress," Rafael said with a supportive smile. "Thank you, Rafael. I know that it's not easy for you either," Eduardo responded, sweating and panting. Armando, despite his full schedule, made sure to be present whenever he could. He wanted to make up for lost time with his son and show that he was committed to recovering. Eduardo one day brought some food and prepared a meal for the three of us. "Son, I made your favorite food. I thought you would like a little comfort in the midst of all this," Armando said, placing the plates on the table. "Thank you, Dad. This means a lot to me," Eduardo responded, excited for the simple but meaningful gesture. Weeks passed, and little by little Eduardo began to show signs of improvement. He was physically stronger and more emotionally stable. Rafael and Armando realized that the change and the continuous support was making a difference. However, the peace of mind was short-lived. Eduardo began to feel severe pain in his chest and had difficulty breathing. Rafael, always attentive, noticed that something was wrong and acted quickly. "Eduardo is fine. You have a very bad face," Rafael said. "Worried?" "I don't know, Rafael. I feel very strong pain," Eduardo responded with a weak voice. Rafael wasted no time and immediately called Armando, who was at work. "Armando, we have to take Eduardo to the hospital. Now he is not well," Rafael said, trying to stay calm. "I'm on my way. Don't leave him alone," Armando responded, hurriedly hanging up the phone at the hospital. Eduardo was admitted urgently. Rafael and Armando were in the waiting room, eager for news. Time seemed to pass too slowly while they waited. "I'm not going. I'm going to lose you again, son." "Not now that I've found you," Armando said, his voice full of emotion. "We're going to get through this together, Dad. I'm not going to give up," Eduardo responded, trying to be strong. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize Eduardo. Rafael was next to Armando, offering all possible support. "He is strong, Armando. Eduardo is going to overcome this," Rafael said, trying to console the worried father. Finally, the doctor left the room and addressed them. "Now he is stable. We need to monitor him closely, but I think he will recover," the doctor said with a reassuring tone of voice. Armando and Rafael sighed in relief, but knew that there was still a long road ahead. Eduardo was taken to a room where the two were able to stay by their side. "Son, you are stronger than you think. I am so proud of you," said Armando, holding Eduardo's hand. "Thank you, Dad, and thank you, Rafael, for never giving up on me," Eduardo said with tears in his eyes. During the days in the hospital, they were difficult, but with the constant support of Rafael and Armando, Eduardo, he began to improve again. They spent hours talking, remembering the past, and making plans for the future. "When I leave here, I want to help other people like Rafael helped me. I want to make a difference," said Eduardo, determined. "And you will do it, son. I'm sure of it," Armando responded with pride. The day finally arrived when Eduardo was discharged from the hospital. Rafael and Armando were at his side, ready to take him back to the apartment upon leaving the hospital. It was a moment of celebration and relief. Eduardo felt strong both physically and emotionally, and was eager to start his new life. "I'm so happy you're coming home, son. We have a lot to celebrate," Armando said as he helped Eduardo to get into the car. "Yes, Dad, is a new life for me. and I want to enjoy every moment like this, united by love and purpose. Eduardo, Rafael, and Armando began a new stage of their lives, ready to face the future and transform challenges into opportunities for growth and solidarity. If you like this story, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us to continue sharing wonderful stories like this. And now a new story will appear on your screen. We are very happy to have you here with us. A hug, and until the next video.